Today I'm joined by Kathy Hannun, CEO of Dandelion. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm very excited to have this conversation because I think you're working on something that's really meaningful. But for our audience to get to know you a little bit more as an individual, my understanding is that you're really good at a particular game. I believe it's Scrabble. Is that right?
I do love Scrabble. I don't know if I would claim to be really good at it, but yeah, I have a lot of fun with it.
I think you're just being very modest. And then when you were a kid, you used to collect something, and it was quite a bit in terms of the kind of the inventory. What was that?
Yeah, my best friend and I used to collect four-leaf clovers every day when we were out at recess, and we had a goal to be in the Guinness Book of World Records, because what middle schooler doesn't want to be in the Guinness Book of World Records? Except then we actually read the Guinness Book of World Records and realized that the record holder was a prisoner, I think in Canada, who had collected tens of thousands of four-leaf clovers. So we gave up on that dream.
Well, I do think that he had an advantage. He had a lot of time.
He had a lot of time on his hands. But even to this day, if I'm just walking along, I do see them. It's like I've trained my eye to be like, oh, four-leaf clover. So it's a little bit of a skill that I guess I have from when I was a kid.
Well, I think it's very appropriate that your startup is named Dandelion because it comes from that. And of course, I think as we get into the geothermal, it makes a lot of sense as well. Now, my understanding is that it's a spin-off from Google X that typically pursues moonshot opportunities. Can you tell us about Google X? And I know you were with Google X for some time as well. And ultimately, do they have ownership and then control as part of the portfolio?
Sure, of course. So I was, as you said, at Google X for about 5 years. And my job there was to find new moonshots for X to pursue. And the way that X defines a moonshot is a huge problem that could yield to a technology solution and impact the lives of hundreds of millions or billions of people. And I never would have predicted geothermal heat pumps would be would be the thing that would capture my imagination and seem to fit those criteria so well. But it was. And so we really, the more we learned about the opportunity, the more excited we became. But it also became clear that, installing ground loops and heating systems in homeowners' houses in upstate New York, I think it's safe to say it was a bit outside of Alphabet's core competencies, or just, it was very different than the other projects that Alphabet had. And so we agreed with X that we would spin it out as its own company. And the way we structured it is we pretty much treated X like an incubator, because we had benefited so much from all the technical resources that X had to offer: teams of mechanical engineers, teams of electrical engineers, and business analysts. And so, when we separated out and went outside of Alphabet, X retained some equity in Dandelion, and Dandelion retained all of the IP that we had developed while we were at X.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of the arrangement. Now let's kind of get into the heart of this. So you're providing affordable geothermal energy to residential homes.
That's right.
And it's really by harvesting the renewable thermal energy below the ground. And when you look at the Earth's surface, when you go kind of below that 6 to 10 feet, the ground tends to be around 50 to 50 degrees in Fahrenheit, pretty much more or less constant. And you're taking advantage of that difference in temperature below the ground versus above the ground to be able to actually optimize and actually lower the cost of build. So how does that exactly work?
Well, you have described it very well. So yes, that is exactly what you said. We're harnessing the renewable thermal energy. It's essentially sunlight that has been soaked into the earth and just sort of remains there year round. And one common question we get from homeowners is, it's only 50 degrees. I obviously want my house to be much warmer than that. How does it work? And the way it works is the system that we replaced your furnace with, it's called a heat pump, or a geothermal heat pump. And heat pumps are exactly what they sound like. They're machines that pump heat from one place to another. And it's an unfamiliar term to many people, but it's actually, these systems are ubiquitous. So your refrigerator is a heat pump. It's pumping heat from the inside of your refrigerator to the outside, which is why if you put your hand against the grate on the bottom, it feels warm. That's heat getting pumped out of your refrigerator. And an air conditioner is another very familiar type of heat pump, which is pumping heat from your house to the outside air. What geothermal does is it pumps heat between your house and the ground. So in the winter, it will pump heat from the ground into your house. And in the summer, it pumps heat from your house into the ground. And it's able to raise the temperature in your house above 50 degrees because it's not equilibrating the temperature. It's actually collecting heat from the ground, concentrating it. So that boosts the temperature to something more like 120. And then it uses your home's existing distribution system, be that ductwork or whatnot, to move that heat throughout your house.
And what you're talking about is under the ground is something called the ground loops.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could just go into a little bit of the physics around the ground loops and how that moves from the, let's say in the case of winter, which is coming up for us, when it's cold outside, but it's that 50, 55 below the surface.
Sure. So what a ground loop is, and I'll just describe how the system is set up because it helps to do that first, and then we can talk about how heat is transferred from the ground into the house. So you have a ground loop, which is 1.25 inch plastic pipe shaped like a very long, thin U, and it tends to be about 300 to 500 feet deep into the ground. So imagine a very long, thin pipe that goes 500 feet deep and then comes back, hairpin turn, comes back that 500 feet back up, and then connects into your house, usually through the basement wall, to the heat pump, which sits where the furnace used to be. So for most homes in New York, that would be the basement, but if you don't have a basement, it could be a utility closet. That pipe is just filled with water, and the water has a propylene glycol antifreeze in it to prevent it from freezing in the winter, but it's mostly just water. So let's say it's the middle of the winter. Water will go from that heat pump in your basement out to your ground loop, underground the whole time. So this is invisible if you're on the surface. It then goes, let's say, 500 feet down and makes the journey 500 feet back up. And in that time, that water has become the temperature of the ground because it's just absorbing heat from being in contact with the ground. So it's going to become, let's say, 50 degrees. Then it goes back into your house, back into your heat pump. And then when it's in your heat pump, it goes through a heat exchanger. So it transfers that heat from the water to a refrigerant. And that refrigerant goes through a vapor compression refrigeration cycle. So essentially, we're using the electricity that runs your system to compress that refrigerant, boost the temperature, and then exchange that heat with the air that's then circulated throughout your house. Once that heat has been extracted from the refrigerant, it just goes back and gets absorbs heat from the next sort of unit of water that's coming through your heat pump. So the whole thing is a closed loop cycle where the water continuously is flowing in a closed loop throughout the ground into your heat pump in the house.
So for me, because I tend to cover a lot of technical areas, this makes perfect sense. But for some of our other listeners, they're probably a little bit confused as to what exactly is this, and it sounds daunting. So tell us about kind of the implementation in terms of if somebody wants to actually, purchase a Dandelion Air, what would it involve? What's the kind of work, and then the duration before it's up and running?
Of course, I will absolutely talk about the process of getting it installed. To your comment about it feeling daunting, I think that you're right, but I think a lot of us don't stop to ask, how does an air conditioner work? If you actually talk about the mechanics of what's going on in there, it's very similar. And running a geothermal heat pump is very similar to running an air conditioner on a 50-degree day, especially if that air conditioner could run in reverse and provide heating instead of air conditioning. That's exactly all that's happening. But to your question of how does this actually work in terms of getting one of these systems installed, what our process is a homeowner signs up to get the system. We send somebody out to their house, and that person takes a bunch of measurements of the house so that we can tell how much heating does this house need to be comfortable? What size system do they need so they can heat the house and cool the house to whatever temperature they want to, and it will, perform excellently. So we get those measurements, and then we create a design for that homeowner, which specifies how many feet of ground loop do you need. Does it need to be 300 feet, 500 feet? Do you need one loop, two loops? What's the size of the heat pump that they need? So we determine those things, and then to put the ground loop in, we have a drill come to the house and dig usually what's between a 4-inch and an 8-inch hole that goes 300 to 500 feet deep into the ground. And then we put that plastic ground loop in that very narrow, thin, deep hole and fill it with grout. So it's filled with a material kind of similar maybe to cement, non-toxic, just like a filler material used to make sure that heat can travel very well from that ground loop to the ground. And then we dig a trench between that ground loop and the house so that we can bring the pipes from the ground loop into the house. Then we just take out the furnace and put a heat pump in its place, connect all the wires and the plumbing, connect it to the ductwork, and turn it on, and it's good to go. We're also able to remove, if the homeowner has air conditioning already ready, we can remove it because the system does heating and air conditioning, so they no longer need a separate air conditioning system. And once, it's all said and done, you can't see the ground loops because they're buried. So there's nothing on the exterior of the house that gives away that house has geothermal. It would only be the absence of things that gives it away. So if they don't have an outdoor compressor, or if they don't have like a propane tank, or that sort of thing, then it could be that they have geothermal.
That's really exciting. And then the duration, how long from the time that they decide, let's go, to time that it's operational?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it varies a lot depending on the type of homeowner and the location. So some of our homeowners are new construction, and then we're kind of on their timeline, like when are they ready for us to come and install. Some of our towns don't have any permitting requirements, so there's no wait time in terms of getting the permit from the town to do the work. Other towns do have permitting requirements, and they can be anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. But to answer your question, on average, it's usually a few months from contract signed to installation complete. But the actual duration of the work, like when, let's say, drilling begins to install complete, is a matter of weeks.
True.
And the drilling itself usually takes 1 to 2 days, and then the heat pump install usually takes 1 to 2 days.
Right. So share with us, in terms of, as a percentage, the kind of savings, whether it's electric savings or just energy savings, by taking this approach.
Yeah, of course. So in New York, where we're based, it's very common for homeowners to be spending about $3,000 to $4,000 a year on fuel oil to heat their homes or propane to heat their homes. Our homeowners tend to see annual savings of around $1,000 to $2,000 once they adopt geothermal. So it's very significant. Some homeowners choose to pay up front for the system, and then they have a payback period, which is usually 5 to 7 years, typically. Some homeowners pay over time, so we offer financing products so you can pay nothing up front and then pay a monthly payment. And those homeowners tend to they're cash flow positive, so they pay nothing up front and they pay less per month than they were paying for oil. So it just, like, depending on the homeowner's goals and whether they want to make an upfront payment or not. We see about half choose one way and half choose the other.
Okay, great. Couple of questions. One is, I think in doing a little bit of background research, I get the sense that your organization is very interested in standardizing, making sure that there's not a lot of customization, in the sense of it lowers the cost for the eventual residential owner. So that's one piece. And how do you do that? The second part of it is, ultimately, your business model is a distribution business problem in the sense of who are you really selling to and how do you actually sell in volume? So that ultimately, like you said, whether it's new developers or maybe it's building permit standards or it's lead standards, where it's just what you have to install in order to meet certain energy requirements.
So
So
for
how?
the,
Yes.
go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So for the standardization question, yeah, it's a very core value that we have here. We're constantly asking, how do we create a process and a product that works for the majority of homes and that's consistent across those homes? Because when you're able to do that, the cost of all of your components and the complexity of the installation process, it drops precipitously. And complexity and cost have been two of the barriers really preventing geothermal from becoming a mainstream technology. And I think that this is a very common theme across any retrofit product. So meaning anytime you're going to existing homes that have already been built and changing something, the hard part about that is that every home is slightly different. So how can you look at these homes in a way that takes advantage of the ways that they're actually all the same? And rooftop solar had to solve this problem too. How do they, there are different types of roofs, they have different pitches, there are trees some places and not others, they face north or south or east or west. So like, how do you create the right software and tools and process so that you can very quickly and efficiently quote that product and then install it in a way that's not exorbitantly expensive? So we're trying to bring geothermal on a similar path and really take similar initiative to find a system that works really well for the majority of homes. And we have to be okay with the fact that we can't serve every single home, because if we did that, then we would be no different than the very expensive geothermal providers that have existed in the past. But to your second question about distribution, we had a decision early on in the company. Do we want to go, what's our, you can do geothermal for any building. St. Patrick's Cathedral has geothermal, houses, obviously, schools, like there are many different buildings where you can do geothermal. So we had to ask ourselves, where should we start? And the reason we decided to start with residential retrofit, even though on the surface it does seem like a harder problem in some ways, is because each individual homeowner can decide for themselves, like, do they want to buy the product or not? And so your sales process is very simple. It's one or two stakeholders that own the home making a decision. Whereas if you go after some of these larger projects, you have to, it's just a much more complex and lengthy sales cycle. So at this stage in the company, when we're just getting started, it was helpful to have that simpler sales process. And what we found, fortunately, is that there's so much demand for geothermal that distribution and sales really hasn't been a problem. In fact, we're selling, since the beginning, we have a backlog of customers where we have to grow our operations as quickly as we can, and we still can't keep up with the demand from homeowners. And I think we're seeing that because homeowners with fuel oil especially, but with many different homeowners, they haven't had an option to do anything different. So like if you don't like using fuel oil, it's expensive, it's inconvenient, but you don't have access to natural gas, which millions of people do not, you don't really have a choice. You're like stuck with it. So when we're able to bring this lower cost, renewable, better experience, more convenient option, it's like there's not a lot of reason not to do it, I guess. And we're seeing this huge demand for it. So it's really exciting for me because the mission of the company is to get rid of fossil fuels in heating. And it seems like homeowners are ready to do that, which is very encouraging.
It is encouraging. And the thing is, they don't actually have to be a proponent of climate change or climate change action.
No,
it just
not at all.
Economically and from a choice perspective, it just makes sense for a lot of them.
Right.
So I think that the market fit that you've identified is really ideal. And for listeners, if you're trying to figure out like why is this part of or was part of Google X, I think like we were talking about before the recording is that the fundamental technology, the physics of it, has been there for many decades. Its ability to not only miniaturize it but create the processes and the tools in such a way that you're dropping the marginal cost of each of these units. That's the real innovation. Is that right?
That is right. And I think it works well that heat pumps themselves are such a known, old, established technology because, to be honest with you, I don't blame homeowners for not wanting to take a big risk on how they're heating their home in the winter, right? You want to be able to depend on a very proven, old, established technology to deliver heat to your house in the winter. And so the fact that we've been able to use technology innovation and product innovation to just really ease the installation process, make it less expensive, make it easier. I think that is where you would want the new technology to come into play.
Yeah. Let's just kind of dream a little bit in the sense that I know what your target focus is, and certainly not advocating that you deviate from it. But let's say years down the road after Series E IPO, and you're thinking about pursuing different markets. So if you think about kind of the biggest offenders in terms of CO2 are going to be data centers, as an example, large
Mm-hmm.
skyscraper buildings. Do you think that it's plausible that by the time that you get to that point and you're interested in, that's a market that you want to pursue, that you would have created almost like a compartmentalized kind of a design structure where it's almost like a building block. So regardless how big the energy footprint is, you can actually kind of meet that in a cost-effective manner to reduce the energy consumption as well as the carbon footprint.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with the way you've characterized that. I think that for any building, when you measure how much heating and cooling capacity does it need, you're translating, okay, if this building needs this much heating and cooling, it needs this many feet of ground loops. And how you arrange those ground loops, is it one extremely deep ground loop? Is it a bunch of shallower ones? Like, how are they arranged with each other? It's sort of up to you. So you can imagine that like the main difference between a very large building and a smaller one is just you need more ground loops or deeper ground loops, and you need more heat pumps in the building or larger heat pumps. And so there's a lot of what we're doing today and establishing today in the single family retrofit market will be directly applicable to new markets. And the first one we're considering is, as you might imagine, new build. So
Mm-hmm.
let's stop building homes that depend on fossil fuels for heating. Let's just like start doing it right from the beginning, show that renewable heating and cooling can work really well for the new builder. And yeah, we're already engaged in sort of initial discussions to move into that market. And then from there, I think there are lots of small businesses that are very similar to homes. And then you can go to some of these bigger buildings or multifamily. So yes, when I look years down the line, I do think that this company will build the tool set that we need to go after many different types of buildings. And we have to, because we have to figure out how to get heating renewably.
I am so excited. Just that I'm introverted, so you don't necessarily see my expressiveness come out. But what you're working on is so profound, and it truly is a global opportunity that I'm very, very excited. And your approach makes a lot of sense, and I'm super big fan at this point. So the question that we always ask at the end is, what was your biggest product innovation failure, and what was the lesson learned?
Yes. So early on in Dandelion, we wanted to create a financial product that allowed people to use sort of a lease or a PPA to pay for their heating, similar to what solar does. We currently offer, you can pay up front, you can get a loan, but we didn't have a lease or a PPA. And so I hired a consulting firm with individuals that had really created some of these products for the solar industry. So they were very knowledgeable about what it was like to create a renewable PPA or lease for a homeowner. And we worked for months on sort of analyzing the economics and putting together sort of the framework for what this financial product would look like. And then at the 11th hour, the tax credits changed. So we got this new tax credit for geothermal, and it really disincentivized third-party ownership. So all of a sudden, leases and PPAs were way worse economically than loans and what we already had. And so we just like didn't move forward with that work. But I think, you know, while we couldn't have predicted that shift in tax policy, it would have been a failure anyway. Like, I actually think that was a stroke of luck because it caused us not to sink any more time into what was a very distracting product innovation. And the reason I say that is we have off-the-shelf loans that work very well for our homeowners. And sales, as I mentioned earlier, isn't our biggest need as a company. Like, we really have, our challenge is to get the drills into market, to train the installers, to sort of ramp up our operations. And so we were spending a lot of time developing a product where there wasn't a demonstrated enough need in the market, and it was so vulnerable to policy shifts. And so after that experience, I've just been much more careful about, you only have so many resources. There's so much work to do to go after a mission as big as ours. Let's be very confident that the projects that we're choosing to tackle are few and the most meaningful.
That is a great insight, absolutely great insight. And I hope that that's a takeaway for our listeners as well. So today I've been joined by Kathy Hannun, CEO of Dandelion. Kathy, thank you for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.